this week being such an integral moment for concussion awareness. We're really honored to be here and kind of share a bit of our journey, a bit of our knowledge, talk about our experiences with the injury, and bring in some amazing people. So,
Yeah, and a lot of this comes from us when we were growing up, and we weren't able to necessarily get the education that we were hoping to have. And that wasn't too long ago, to be honest. We were going through sport, and a lot of people that we were around didn't necessarily understand the injury. So that was something that we definitely noticed, and we'll be sharing some more about that throughout this discussion here. But yeah, really, really happy and excited to be here. That's for sure.
the
Yeah,
big
go ahead.
thing too is that we want to establish a safe environment where we can have these open conversations and really dive into the inner complexities of this invisible injury, and that's a key thing too. And we're going to talk a bit more about what that means, it being an invisible injury, how it impacts not only athletes but all of their support system as well, coaches, teammates, parents, governing bodies. So it's incredible that we have an amazing organization like the Sport North Federation wanting us to kind of talk upon or touch upon this topic and dive into it more.
Yeah, and I guess Seth, would you be able to? Because I think we got at least half of the people in here that are we're expecting. So we might as well start. Would you be able to do a quick overview, just of what everybody can expect today, and then we'll just get right into it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure more people will keep filing in, but essentially, what our overview is going to look at for throughout this webinar is we're going to kind of touch upon what is a concussion. Now, that might seem like a pretty basic concept, but we're going to really dive into the inner complexities that surrounds that. We're going to talk about how it relates to mental health, and it's something that is really near and dear to both Ryan and myself, as that is there's a big lack of understanding to the connection between concussions and mental health. So, really, I'm going to dive into how they connect and some of the links there. And then we're going to bring in our incredible speakers that we have, Scott Cockburn, who is a youth soccer coach, and kind of get that coach's perspective. Then we have Mike Jorgensen, who has his PhD and is now diving into the research of sport and concussion prevention. And then we'll bring in Kylie Hamilton and kind of get that athlete perspective, and how she's kind of her whole life's changed since this injury, and how passionate she is and wanting to do more within the field as well. And then after all of that is said and done, we're going to have an open Q&A session. We have our colleague Emma that will be in the chat, providing questions throughout. So please feel free to engage. Like we mentioned, this is an open dialogue that we want to have. She'll also be sending in resources, and we'll have a resource list that will give you, or that will send everyone at the end of it. So that's pretty much, to sum it up, what we're going to go forward and talk about throughout this presentation.
Yeah, and just the overall purpose of what we're trying to go for here is just to educate people through our own personal experiences with the injury. Like I said, we grew up playing sport, and we didn't necessarily have the understandings around us to be able to like fully understand what we were going through as athletes. So doing that by sharing our experiences, we found really can help foster that environment where we're able to facilitate some learning. And then on top of that, we're going to bring in experts, coaches, and athletes to talk about their experiences and learnings with the injury as well.
Yeah, so I feel like now is a really good time for us to kind of dive into our personal stories. And I'll pass it over to you, Ryan, the executive director of the Heads Up Concussion Advocacy Network, because you've had multiple concussions. So why don't you talk about your journey and how these injuries have impacted your life?
Yeah, so my name is Ryan Sutton. I am the executive director of the Heads Up Concussion Advocacy Network. And basically, I've had 8 concussions throughout my life. So my first one came when I was 7 years old in a biking accident. I was actually knocked out for several minutes, woke up at the hospital, had no idea what was going on. And as I progressed into my teens, I was playing high level hockey. And I wasn't necessarily, I didn't know at the time, but having that concussion when I was younger actually made me more susceptible to getting concussions later in life. So as I was going through high school, I got a concussion in grade 10, 11, and 12. So 3 consecutive years. And that definitely left me in a weird position. And as I had mentioned, that kind of really brought forth a lot of misunderstandings within my team dynamic, with my coaches, some of my friends as well, not necessarily understanding why I was setting out. I looked fine, but I was still sitting out. So, not a lot of people, especially in the small town that I grew up in with roughly 2 to 3,000 people there at the time, there wasn't any understanding about how that injury works and why it was even relevant to be sitting out at all. Um, so after that, I also went to university. That's actually where Seth and I met. We ended up living together, and I sustained another concussion playing hockey in the summer between our second and third year. And it basically, that was probably my worst concussion to date. It really showed me that there is still not necessarily an organization, or at the time in 2016, there wasn't an organization out there that could really help people feel and be understood. That was kind of what I was worried about going through my concussion is, again, it was just that same process of not necessarily having people understand where I was coming from or what I was necessarily even going through. So in when I was talking with Seth when we got back to school, he was able to actually share a bit about what he was going through, and we had a really great conversation, and it really brought us together in a new way. And yeah, I guess that can lead right into Seth's story.
Yeah, so I suffered my one and only diagnosed concussion. That's obviously a key term there because I actually played 8 years of varsity football. And the concussion I received was in my final year of high school. It was a week before the season started. It was practice. I remember I went to make a play on one of my best friends who is a lot bigger than me. His knee went into my head, and I was very disoriented immediately, and my coaches said you should go get it checked out. I was diagnosed with a mild concussion, which we've now learned since that time back in 2014. There's no such thing as a mild concussion. It's a like a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury, but there isn't really that distinction within the degrees of the concussion injury. And I was told, like many people that we've met along our journey, 1 to 2 weeks and you'll be back. And 4 to 6 weeks later, I was still dealing with symptoms, and it was a very alienating experience that I don't think I really understood how much it impacted me until, like Ryan said, we started having a bit of a conversation and realized that sometimes even when you have these injuries and you're going through the motions, it can really linger for months, years later, and you don't realize how those all connect from that incident. And so I'm sure, playing football, I was also a goalie in hockey, and I was just a very active kid growing up that I've had a lot more as I've bonked my head a few times. And as we also know about concussions, you don't need to just hit your head. So I'm pretty sure I've had a few more than just the one diagnosed, but it was really when I talked to Ryan when I realized how much it impacted me and how much it must impact others, because although me and Ryan had this same injury, our experiences were very different. And that kind of led us into wanting to talk more about this. And it led us to our mission of wanting to challenge the stigma and becoming the leader in Canada on concussion awareness and understanding the holistic experience of concussions and mental health. And that's led us on an amazing journey where we get to talk to wonderful people like yourself in webinars like this. We've also produced podcasts, videos. We really try to use the new age of digital media to bring almost a new reform of knowledge translation to concussions and to the general public, as there's still some pretty crazy and honestly some scary stats about the lack of understanding that Canadians have towards this injury that the government of Canada released back in 2018. So it's really been an incredible, fulfilling, and grateful journey that both Ryan and myself have been on. And now that we've kind of touched a bit about our experiences with these injuries, let's kind of dive into some of the education. And as I've kind of already talked about, I want to ask you, Ryan, this injury is very complex. Can you kind of give us a deeper understanding of what is a concussion?
Yeah, so quite simply, it can be seen as straightforward, or I'm going to make it in a straightforward manner. So basically, it's if you were to hit your head, neck, or body, and that hit to the head, neck, or body would create enough force for your brain to move rapidly inside your skull to cause some sort of internal neural tears that basically results in a concussion. So these neural tears can impact and disrupt many different functions within the human brain. So it can disrupt vision, balance, coordination, speech, memory, sleep, processing speeds, mental health, and so much more. And the one thing that, because I'm also doing my master's at Brock University, studying concussion actually in sport. And the one thing that I've really grown to understand is that no two injuries are the same. And the one thing that actually kind of makes sense from a science perspective when you're thinking about those neural tears, so like those neurons in your brains that are they're connecting. And there's a great saying that neurons that wire together fire together. So when it comes to a brain injury, when your neurons are not connecting properly or connection has been disrupted, this actually happens in different areas for different people. So this kind of talks more about the individualized experience of what a concussion is. So say for instance, I was to get a concussion and Seth was to get a concussion. Our concussion symptoms can manifest in completely different ways because those neural tears are happening in different parts of our brain. So symptoms that I may have, Seth may not have, and vice versa. So the way that these injuries present is such a wide spectrum. So in from a coach's perspective, a sport administration perspective, or a parent's perspective, it's really important to note that just because somebody doesn't have a headache or just because somebody isn't struggling with their processing speed or memory, there are other factors that could be in play that would impact their concussion experience. And another part of this is that, for instance, I've had many different concussions. I've had 8 total. And some of those concussions, I would say for the most part, they've all presented themselves in a unique way. So basically meaning that I've like my one concussion I've had, like it was more headaches, and then the other one, it was probably more the vision, and it's actually why I have glasses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those experiences just so you can have a bit more context of that. But so basically, as I mentioned, in high school, I sustained 3 concussions from hockey, and then 2 years later, actually another one from hockey. So all of those ones, interestingly enough, actually presented very similar. I actually ended up getting like stitches in my chin and on my ear as well. And there, for those ones, there was a lot of like cognitive issues related to my vision, some memory, a lot of brain fog, and then I also was dealing with headaches. And sensitivity to light has kind of always been a big thing in my life. I end up wearing sunglasses every time I'm outside because I find it very irritating. Um, but then, for instance, a concussion that I had probably 3 years ago now, actually, it was when I was working outside and I was actually walking a wheelbarrow and I fell. And there was a big branch on the ground that actually I landed on. And it was weirdly curved for some reason. It was curved and I basically landed on it, and it my momentum projected that right into the side of my head. And what was interesting about this concussion was that I actually didn't feel any symptoms. I actually, because at that time we were far along in this journey for Heads Up, and I was like, okay, I know now more about concussions than I ever have. I'm going to sit here, assess how I'm feeling, completely try and understand everything to determine if I should go back to work or not. So I sat there and I did a systems check. Am I feeling anything mentally? How am I doing? Everything was great. It was really strange to me because I knew that was a big hit and it was not something that I took lightly. So I actually continued to work, felt fine that night. And then a few days later, that happened on the Monday, I believe it was the Thursday, I actually started to feel a lot of anxiety. I had no idea why. I typically wouldn't get anxious. And basically, this anxiety forced me to like be like, how do I get rid of it? I don't really feel this very often. So I went to my home gym at the time and started lifting because I was like, I guess physical exertion could help with this. And then all of a sudden, as I do that lift, all of my symptoms just came out of nowhere. And this is 3, 4 days later. So basically my point is it's very important to know that they can present in different ways, and they also don't always present at the onset of the injury. So, and that anxiety for me, I guess, was a predictor to say, like, hey, like you have something going on. Maybe it's time to pay attention to it. So, there's small things like that with a concussion. Um, and then my most recent one that actually came in February of this year, it was an activity that I was just hanging out with my friends, a very small group of us because of COVID, of course. And we were actually playing some sort of soccer. And I went to kick the ball, and I guess I'm not as flexible as I remember, and basically flipped and landed on my back. And I didn't even hit my head. I landed on my back. And then I kind of got up and I was like, whoa, okay, that was a little weird. Wasn't feeling too good. But ultimately, I just kept having this raging headache. And the next day when I woke up, it was all the same, more of the same. And I've never felt a headache like that before. And I didn't necessarily know if that was because of my fall or with whatever was happening because we are hanging out with friends. And so ultimately realize, okay, I have a concussion again, and it gets to be a draining process, of course, but ultimately I did have a hard time accepting that one because it came in such like a fun loving environment. It was a harmless thing that I didn't necessarily want to believe I could get a concussion from that, especially because I didn't hit my head. So yeah, I just wanted to share that story to also show that you don't need to hit your head. It could just be something that jars your body. And ultimately, that left me with a lot of vision, neural fatigue, and anxiety again. So I started to learn a bit about how to manage that through meditation, which really helped me. But yeah, I guess that's a little bit about what a concussion is, how it can manifest through my own experiences, kind of mixed with a bit of research there. But I'm going to pass it over to Seth, who's going to talk a bit about concussions and mental health. And I know because he's been through a bit of that personally. And yeah, here you go, Seth.
Yeah, you touched upon a really important thing just on the individualized nature of concussions. And especially because this is, as I mentioned earlier, an invisible injury, right? And for me, when I suffered my concussion, um, I was able to go back to school and be a student fairly quickly, but it wasn't until about 6 weeks, like I'd mentioned, where I was able to play football again. And a lot of my friends and teammates didn't understand why I could be in classes with them, but I couldn't practice with them or playing games. And it was very alienating for me to go through that experience. And especially since, you know, you want to play in the game as an athlete. We're creatures of competition. For the most part, we want to always reach these higher level of performances, and it creates this disconnect where you want to get back there. You see your friends practicing, playing in games, and you're on the bench and on the sideline. In my case, but you just know you're not right, and you have to stay true to that, and that's a really hard thing to do as a kid. Thankfully, I have a really amazing support system with my mom, my brother, and my dad that really helped me out throughout my journey. Because this one thing that's very evident when it comes to concussions. Yes, that's say you know 70 to 80% of people that suffer concussion will heal within 2 to 4 weeks, and that is you know a very optimistic way of looking at it. But those other 20% could last a lot longer. And the fact of the matter is, this injury and this recovery process is non-linear. And what that means is that there isn't really a step-by-step process where, once you suffer this injury, here's the things that you can do and you are going to be better. It's one, and what a non-linear process is defined as is one based on continual growth, occasional setbacks, and learning from your experiences. And I think that's such a valuable thing to let these athletes know, especially, high school athletes, but really at all levels, that you have a brain injury. The brain is something that, is responsible for your daily function. We've got billions of neurons that are so in our brains, responsible for everything we do in life. And if we don't take that time that we need to recover and rush into it, we can start dealing with a lot more symptoms. And for me, it came in the form of anxiety and depression. Growing up, I wasn't a kid that had any mental health complications, And it's funny, as I touched upon it earlier, I don't think I realized the correlation between my anxiety and depression and my concussion until me and Ryan had this conversation in university and have gone on our journey ever since. And, it was a really big battle, and it was tough too, because like I mentioned, like all I wanted to do was play football in my final year and get back out there, but understanding that I couldn't risk it and understanding the importance of our long-term health. And I know that's something we're going to touch upon with all of our experts, but it really dives into this bigger conversation within sport culture and stigma. And that's where I want to bring it right back to Ryan, because that is something that you're obviously extremely passionate about and now doing your master's in. So can you touch upon the role stigma has in concussions in sports?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I am studying concussion stigma in sport through my master's, and the one thing I'm just going to provide a little bit of overview of what stigma is and how you can kind of see it happening when, say, mental health or a concussion is to happen within a sporting environment. So yeah, so basically, stigma arises from a dilemma of difference. So, what that means is at any point, if there are any sort of differences or desired or undesired traits, so in sport, you can think about it as like masculinity or mental toughness. Those would be desired traits when you're trying to be competitive. Whereas undesired traits would be seen as weak or some sort of weakness, or even derogatory terms that portray weakness. Um, so basically, that for when it talks about stigma and concussions, that's what we're talking about here, are those undesired and desired traits. So and those actually can come and be kind of shown through the way that the dominant groups or the groups of power, so say sport administration or coaches or parents, are actually portraying the way that they view these injuries as well. So the onus is on the coaches and the parents and the sport administration to kind of foster that culture that doesn't breed any stigma, that accepts the nonlinear individual aspects of what a concussion recovery is. And also kind of, and we'll talk about it later, but establishing values based around health and long-term athletics, right? I know sometimes we can get caught up in the competitive side of sport, but ultimately it's physical activity through competition, and that's what we want to work towards. So and then three dimensions of stigma that is something to be mindful of, especially in the sport environment. So maybe you can disrupt it if it's happening, or just to be mindful is the first dimension is stereotypes. So when we're looking at stereotypes, we really want to understand like what people are being labeled as if they're going through a concussion. So for me, I was labeled as weak, or because I played hockey, it was just like, oh, he doesn't want to go in the corners, or basically things that people would say to me, when in reality, I just wanted to protect myself and I wanted to still compete. I wanted to perform at my best, but I needed to protect myself in those areas because I realized I had had so many brain injuries. And then what comes next, the second dimension, is fear. So when we talk about fear, it definitely relates to anxiety a little bit, but fear of like the way that people perceive that individual with the concussion and how like actually they're perceived in the social sense. So maybe the teammates don't know how to approach them, and or maybe the coaches aren't familiar with those processes. So on how like you can normalize the recovery process. So understanding that fear can be an element and kind of getting over that fear, and basically allowing a space where everybody can be together and be harmonious in what they're going through. So eradicating fear is definitely an important part of it. The third dimension of stigma that I'll talk about here is social control. So what I mean by that, and this is kind of the one that hits home the most with sport and just stigma in general. Without this one, stigma doesn't necessarily exist. So when a player is trying to look and stay in their spot. So for instance, one of the fear components could be, oh, I may lose my spot on the team, on the roster. I may lose my time on the power play if I choose to like take time to rest my brain with a suspected injury. So losing that spot can be a form of social control because it is a social mechanism, right? So This is what keeps players from playing and not disclosing their injury when they're hurt. So this is definitely something to be mindful of in that process, because that's an element that could keep players in and actually lead them to maybe a potential for second impact syndrome, which could actually lead to possible death if not treated properly. So there are definitely a lot of things to be mindful when looking at it from a sport organization perspective. Um, but yeah, so those are the three dimensions of stigma and how to recognize it. I'm going to pass it over to Seth here.
And I think, one of the biggest things when it comes to challenging the stigma, which, as I mentioned earlier, is our mission here at Heads Up Can, is having a team approach. And I think that's why we're really excited about the speakers that we're going to be bringing on very shortly, is because it's really imperative to understand that everyone plays a role in supporting someone, and especially an athlete, a young athlete, in the recovery process. And I know for me, when I got my concussion, my coaches looked at me differently in football. They almost thought I was lesser of an athlete, of a player, of a competitor in a lot of ways, because I looked fine, but I wasn't practicing or playing. And it was a very, tough thing to go through as a, 16, 17-year-old kid, where your coaches didn't really believe you. And that's why I am really excited to bring in Scott, to kind of share, his insight and his perspective on the role a coach can have with athletes in the recovery. So Scott, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Seth. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too, man. So I kind of want to just start by just asking you, what is your, experience with athletes receiving a concussion, and how have you been able to manage that over your career as a soccer coach?
Yeah, an amazing timing too. We're just going through our tryouts for the new season right now here in town, and we had two concussion situations yesterday. So it was funny as I was going through that and helping the other coaches through that process. I was thinking about our call tonight. So with sport, is the first thing is a complete stop. And I heard Ryan mention earlier just an assessment of everything, your body, your control, and it is. And with soccer, there is contact. I think some of the conception sometimes is there isn't a lot of contact in soccer, but it really is one of the sports where we direct athletes at a competitive level to use their head. They physically hit their head off the ball deliberately without padding equipment that's there. So we are always consciously looking to see, is there a lingering effect from any of those contacts? So yesterday was a situation where twice that was it. The athlete decided to make a decision to head the ball that was high in the air and took two staggering steps and dropped to their knees. So those were very obvious signs that something was wrong. But the fact is, it isn't always that obvious. We have to really be conscious of the symptoms and signs from those situations. So when there is something wrong, especially as a coach, we always say check your gut feeling. If something's not right, stop everything, get the player to the game as quick as you can, or the practice or the activity, and evaluate the situation. So
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting scenario because tryouts, they have their own kind of competitiveness to it that it has to be understood, especially from a coach's perspective. So, how would you go about evaluating that player when they are getting that concussion in the tryouts? Because obviously they would be worried about, oh my God, I got a concussion in tryout. What if I don't make the team now? How does that work from your perspective? And I'm sure you're feeling this process out for yourself. So, sorry to put you on the spot there, but I thought that's
Nope.
really unique.
No, it's okay. I don't mind that. And that's exactly what happened in both scenarios. It was tryouts. Yeah, they were competing for a roster spot, and both situations were players that were very close to the line of being able to compete. So it's come a long way with the evolution of recognition of head injuries and concussion. So has sport and how we handle that scenario as well too. I know when I played, it was you hit your head, you felt woozy, and you were back on in 30 seconds because that was it. You had one shot to make this team. So in this scenario, it was a little bit different. One of the players had a history of head injuries in the past, and I knew that going into that. So it was an easy stop, and it was we want you to be okay first. We'll give you another shot. Don't fret at this. So we don't rush anymore to create that roster and team. The same thing too. If there was an ankle injury, not a head injury, but an ankle injury, for instance, we still want to give that player a fair chance. So the rush to make that decision at tryout doesn't happen now right away. It used to 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Now we'll give it some time. We'll do a proper assessment. And if we have to put people back on the field at a later date to do that fair evaluation, we will. So that's taking the pressure off the athlete. In the second scenario yesterday, it was even tougher because the parents came right over and said, my kid's never had a head injury. They're fine. Let's get them right back in there. So that was a bit more of a difficult one there. The player did not seem right. There was almost strangely immediately like a headache, and light sensitivity was the first indication and sign. And we're going, no, we can't do this. But both of the parents were right there going, no, we are. And we've got a friend who's a doctor who's over in the field. We're going to bring them over and they're going to tell you it's okay too. So that's a little bbit more of a touchy situation. And that was do you know what? Bringing the doctor is not a bad idea, but we're still going to stop for today and tell you what, here's what we're going to do. We're going to postpone the whole try. We're going to continue on, but we're going to bring everybody back next weekend for an additional session. If you're okay and you're cleared at that time, hey, we'll do that. And if you're not, don't worry, we'll have an evaluation down the road. So I think sport and soccer specifically, I guess is what I can talk to, has given that power to the coaches now to take your time and not pressure an athlete into having to perform and be there when they're not at their best. So,
And it's really amazing to see the progression in just the way that we view these injuries and athletes going through it. But there's still athletes that will hide their symptoms, and it maybe won't be a clear indicator that occurs, like the light sensitivity. And I commend you for having that approach of stopping and reevaluating for another trial, because that's honestly something that I wish was more coaches had that mindset. But you talked about the power and the role that coaches can have. How, in terms of the coach facilitating an environment where they prioritize health first, how have you done that, and how can you say other coaches can aspire to do that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So setting the tone from the beginning. So yesterday through tryouts, at the end of the second session, I had parents meetings where we were discussing that. One of the topics that is discussed is, and again, I apologize, I missed the beginning of the meeting, and maybe you touched on it, but the Rowan's Law that's come into effect as well too. That's something that's been implemented right through Ontario soccer. So we have to address that with the parents right away. And the Rowan's Law is they all do an education course, an information session, and sign off on the risks of that. So that helps the coaches in a lot of sense, because that's bringing the recognition up front. And that's really telling the parents from the beginning, the coaches are trained. The coaches are looking for this. And if they think there's something wrong, they are going to err on the side of caution and stop the athlete until we can have a proper diagnosis be done. We've quite often used with the parents and said, would you let your teenager go out in their car if you knew that the tires weren't working properly? Right? It's the same sort of an idea. If something is wrong, are we going to risk it with your children? No, we're not. We're going to stop, and we're going to make sure that the vehicle, in this case, the player, is at 100% before they continue on. So that's how we address it now.
Yeah, that's it's definitely really interesting. And I guess that kind of a second to that is like, how are you even, like, you're talking with the parents, of course, but is that a similar conversation with the athletes in terms of like creating that culture, or how does that differ?
Yeah. So the ironic thing is we talk a lot about the athletes. The bigger challenge is the parents for the younger ones. I yesterday was youth coaching, and I coach everything from youth all the way into adult. Adult head injuries are probably more difficult to deal with. The symptoms aren't as noticeable. It's easier for them to hide the symptoms if they are. And I've seen it. I even play in a men's, we call it old timers, but it's an over 35 league. And the guys, something's not right. I've seen somebody get a knock to the head and then they just give it a shrug and want to continue on. It's a lot harder to approach that individual to say, hey, John, or whatever their name is, I think you got to give it a rest here. We take a second, step back, have a look at it. Sometimes adrenaline kicks in with these guys as well too. And so until they step off the field and sit down, then they get a little bit woozy and go, yeah, you're right. Something isn't right. So in my experience, sometimes the adults are harder to manage and deal with. The younger age is the second situation with the parents. That was a 12-year-old. So the 12-year-old was it was a 12-year-old girl. She had never gone through it. She knew something wasn't right. She didn't feel right, but had that pressure maybe from the parents that I've got to compete and go. So she didn't know what to do. She probably would have gladly stopped, because most of the athletes will listen to the coaches. But you do have those parents that come in there and do create a situation. So that's probably the toughest part, I think, I find anyway as a coach, is again the adults and the parents more so than the athletes are these days.
No, and that's such a tricky dynamic too, right? Because at the end of the day, you're just trying to do what's best for the athlete and for the kid, right? And thinking about their long-term health. And when their parents are like, no, no, they're fine. That's a very interesting, conversation to have. I can only imagine. I'm curious, when after, we'll use in this case when the player's gone through the concussion protocol, has gotten clearance from doctors and are starting to transition back into the sport. What role do you think a coach can play in kind of making that a bit of a smooth transition, especially in soccer where, when they go back in, they're going to head the ball pretty soon and pretty immediately after, just getting cleared. So how can a coach really help with that transition once they've kind of gone through the removal and are recovering or fully recovered and coming back to play?
Yeah, and you mentioned the word, it's transition, and we do it in moderation. I know, for instance, let's say in football, you'll see that they'll have what they call it the red shirt that they'll throw on the quarterback who's come back from injury, right? It's a non-contact, don't hit. I know hockey will do the same thing. We don't have the red shirt, but that's kind of how it works with practice as well, too. Typically, we'll practice for 90 minutes. That's the length of a regular soccer game for us, so practices are the same. We'll schedule the player to come in and say, we're going to start with half an hour. And here's what you're going to do. You're going to work with a coach and you're going to do some light running, some movement. What we want to do is get the heart rate up and see how they react to that. And that's the first thing there. So we're not even putting a ball at their foot. We're not putting them in contact situations. We just want to see how they move. If they're coming back from a concussion, and I heard Ryan touch on it earlier, different symptoms, signs, and also different rates of or lengths of recovery, that person maybe hasn't run for 2 months because they've been healing from a concussion or head injury. So we want to see how they're going to manage just on the cardio aspect and their heart rate when they're breathing hard. Again, a headache could form. You'll often see the players squinting or not moving well, and sometimes they get nauseous to their stomach. And even it's been a couple of months, you just don't know. So those are the first things you're looking for, just to see how they're moving. Again, medical's come a long way as well too. My daughter suffered a head injury, I guess it was 2 falls ago, so almost 2 years ago. And that was the first time I've actually sat as a parent and gone through what they call the buffalo testing through the concussion symptoms. So it was kind of neat. I thought it was a neat process. I was, like I said, my first time, but we sort of take some of those same tactics onto the field and say, how do you feel when your heart rate goes up? And again, we start at 30 minutes. If they can successfully get through 30 minutes, we'll then book them in for a 60-minute session. And that's when they start moving with players, pumping, and then we get up to a 90. So we kind of gradually get them back into play. A player coming back from a clean bill of health for concussion at competitive soccer, we're often 2 to 3 weeks before we're getting them back into game shape and game ready before they're going to play again anyway. So sometimes parents don't understand that too. The doctor says my kid's fine, we can play Saturday, right? No, they haven't been out. They haven't played for three months potentially. There could be other injuries because of that as well too that we have to take care of. So that's another difficult thing to manage too.
Yeah, and I think like we have touched upon it earlier, but the non-linear process. So for instance, like say that athlete is doing those drills, getting into game shape, and then all of a sudden they have a setback. How are you as a coach able to, I guess, talk them through that process of like kind of taking a step back as the athlete and then also communicating with their teammates to like, hey, like this is happening, and to the parents as well. So kind of that three-prong communication. How are you managing that?
Yeah, it's tough. It's asking a lot of questions. So one of my first questions, again, I'm familiar with my players, but I often go into training environments to help other teams and train, and I don't know the background of the players as well. So that was a situation on both of the ones in the weekend. I have to ask questions. Has there been a head injury before? Right? Have you ever been to a doctor? Has they ever been knocked out? Has there ever been anything at all? And the parents will tell you yes or no. If the answer is yes, there's usually a long pause and they're almost afraid to admit that to the coach. And that's, to me, is terrible. I want to know that right away. In the case of tryouts, those parents were kind of like, well, if I say yes, maybe my kid won't make the team. Right. So that's scary. We don't want people to feel that way. Again, we want athletes to be at 100% their best. So the second part to that was reassurance. I need to know the proper way here, what's going to happen. This is not a reflection of what's going to go on with the tryouts. Right. So That's the management aspect of that. So a lot of questions, a lot of communications. I mean, I typically see athletes who are having their first head injury concussion, to which there's a lot of fear and panic when that happens. Or I see the athletes that have had multiple. And when I say multiple, it could be 3, 4, 5 by that point, which is probably a little bit scarier because that's when something was really wrong. You see the symptoms come out. But at the same time, those are the athletes that are trying to push through it as well, too, right? So again, the communication aspect from that athlete is, do you understand what could go wrong if we continue right now? Right. So it's putting a little bit, I think, fear into them, I guess. This is the reasons that we need to stop, right? We have to focus on your health. We have to focus on you. And then I go back and I use that car analogy that I mentioned earlier with the tires. I said, if you were going to get behind a car and you knew that the tires weren't right, would you want to drive it? No. Well, it's the same thing here. Let's just stop. Let's get the car working properly first, and let's get you back on the road. And I think once you kind of put it into relation of terms like that, then it's a little bit easier to manage with them. So it's my experience anyway. So
No, absolutely. There is definitely something to be said about putting this very complex injury, complex recovery into lay's terms and finding those analogies. And I want to ask you, because you brought up a lot of gems throughout this and a lot of vital things for other coaches to really understand. And you did mention, in Ontario, we're pretty lucky in the sense, not for why Rowan's Law is present because of obviously the tragic story, but the fact that we now have something in place. And this isn't something that is necessarily, seen across Canada or a part of all other provinces in Canada. And when looking at, the Sport North Federation and the territories where they don't have something like Rowan's Law, I want to ask you, what would be one of your biggest pieces of advices for coaches, with understanding this injury and treating it and really just kind of helping them who may not have these background knowledge and understanding? What's that one piece of advice that you can give to a coach related to this?
Well, I think the first thing is err on the side of caution. I mentioned earlier, when we were young, we'd hit our head and we get up and we go play again. It's now with all the different technology and information we have, that's not the case. From my experience, especially in soccer, most of the time when there is a hit to the head, where there's a reaction, a wobble, a fall down or something has happened where there has been some sort of a head injury sustained, right? We're not doctors. We can't determine whether that's a little injury or a big injury. We need to stop. It's happening, and we're seeing it all around the world in sports in particular, that athletes have had significant head injuries and trauma that have lasted and ended careers in professional athletes. So because that is more prevalent and out there, we can talk about that and we can remind the coaches and the parents and say, again, I'm not a doctor. I can't tell you how serious there is. All I can tell you, something is wrong and we have to stop and figure out what it is. So that would be my advice right there. If something seems off and seems wrong, stop. Almost sounds a little too simple, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's simple but effective, and that's honestly, it's a great tidbit, and we really appreciate having you on here, Scott. I think we're going to actually transition to the next speaker here, but we really appreciate all of the advice that you're bringing into us right here. And I know I definitely learned a lot, and even it's crazy that you had that experience like this past weekend with those two athletes too, and to show even how different those situations presented, right? Like two situations happening on the same day, completely different scenarios. So really appreciate you coming in and doing this with us. So if you don't mind, if you could stay for the question and answer period at the end, if that's all right. But yeah, really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, guys. My pleasure.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think, there was so much valuable information that Scott shared, throughout this part, and just understanding, like I said, the important role that everyone has to help these athletes. I think that's something that we're really trying to hammer home, because it was something that it lacked in both Ryan and my experiences. We were very fortunate with our family, but the teammates, the coaches, there was a lot of, or a lack of, comprehension towards what we were going through. And even back then, the research was, was not where it is today. It's rapidly evolved since I went through my concussion. I know even Ryan in his recent one. And that's why we're really excited to bring in Mike here to kind of talk about the research component when it comes to athletes and concussion. So Mike, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy for the invite. Happy to be on the call.
So now we were kind of just talking about the idea of having this team approach. So I wanted to kind of, put that to you and bring that to you of just like, what is the importance of bringing this multifaceted approach to concussion education in sports? And are there any limitations to the current model?
Well, I even just the discussion around a current model suggests that there's agreement on a good way forward there, which it's such a new realm of research that's not necessarily the case. We're constantly learning and constantly evolving our approach to that. But when we look at looking at concussion education, the multifaceted approach, I think some things that Scott was saying there around how many individuals are just implicated in that process. There's so many individuals within the sports system that can influence and impact the outcomes of concussion education and whether the uptake and the results come through that effectively. So looking at it, from the perspective of an athlete, research suggests that even though individuals have a pretty high level of concussion knowledge, they're aware of the symptoms, they're aware of the outcomes, they're aware of the nature of the injury, they still do things like hide their symptoms, right? And so what does that play with that, and what can we do? And as some of the pieces that have been talked about before, just as I caught on the end of that, the last speaker there, is engaging other individuals in that process. So looking at concussion knowledge through education as sort of this necessary piece, but perhaps not sufficient in the overall picture by itself. And so looking at what the focus of the education is, which should be, very sport dependent. So things like peer support in youth sports is something that's very important in concussion recovery. And education can really encourage this behavior. Hey, when your friend gets injured, don't let them hide their symptoms, right? And so it's not just concussion knowledge through this education, but changing their attitudes and intentions towards behaviors and these sort of social behaviors associated with positive recovery and positive health outcomes following injury.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points to definitely consider as you're trying to conceptualize it all. So thank you for that. So Mike, you've written a research paper, and it basically talks about people's or athletes' perceptions of concussions, and you have a wonderful title there. I absolutely love it: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Would you be able to talk about those different perceptions in the good, the bad, and the ugly, and just how that can manifest from an athlete's perspective?
Yeah. So what we did with that study is we looked at an athlete's attitudes and intentions towards risk-taking and protective behaviors as it pertains to concussions. So things with safety behaviors could be like going to the gym, getting fit, doing neck exercises. Whether these have a real benefit or not is relevant, but if they perceive them to have a benefit, then that's important to explore. Or things like letting a teammate know when they're being too aggressive or putting others at risk, or risk-taking behaviors. And one of the questions we had was, would you give someone a concussion if it meant you could win in your sport? And so we really tried to narrow down these attitudes and intentions towards risk-taking and concussion protective behaviors. With that, we did a cluster analysis, which essentially just categorizes responses that sort of fit together well. And we found 3 different groups of athletes. So 3 different types that we labeled. First was proactive, and then reactive, and then indifferent. So proactive athletes, these are the athletes who will do everything in their power to ensure safety of themselves and others. So this could be, again, approaching the referee and saying, hey, so-and-so on my team or this team is getting, the temperature of the game is rising, and that's increasing risk for injury. Let's manage this. Or they're the ones who would report their concussions. Doesn't matter sort of the context of that, but the focus there is that they're being proactive. They're doing everything in their power to engage in that sort of safety or risk mitigating behaviors. Whereas the reactive athletes, looking at their attitudes and intentions towards these behaviors, well, the reactive athletes were just like, yeah, we're not going to do any of this, but if we get a concussion, I'll report it. And we can see that this is, the sort of smaller voices on the teams maybe who are just different intentions, different values, or what they're wanting to get out of the sport. They just, if they get an injury, they'll report it, they'll go through the process, and that's that. But they're not going to call out an opponent. They're not going to call out teammates. They're just there to participate. And then there's this indifferent cluster. And so these indifferent athletes had little to no intention to engage in any risk reduction behaviors or protective behaviors. And so, in fact, they were so it was so low that it was a complete contrast from these other two groups on whether they would report and whether they would hide symptoms. And so, in that sense, they were indifferent to these recovery processes. So this return to play, whether they announce or again report whether they had a concussion or not. And we looked at this and we tried to get at a little bit as to why these athletes hold such strong negative attitudes towards these behaviors. And when I was thinking about that, I was thinking of friends I'd played rugby with or played other sports with, and who sort of fits into these categories and such. But what we found was that this indifferent cluster actually had quite a deep history of concussion. They had, on average, they had sustained a few concussions throughout their experience. And so what we looked at then is we went a little bit further, and it's, well, what are their understandings or their attitudes towards the recovery process? And so we didn't get too much into causal relationships there, but we saw these sort of general trends where these individuals had, they basically just had poor experiences with the process. So it was, I got a concussion, I did report it at one point, but I didn't recover, or my recovery went poorly. Therefore, why would I go through that again? And I think this talks a little bit to the historic piece and the development of concussion return to play protocols, from things like you have to sit in a room by yourself. You have to, turn the lights off, dark room. Someone has to, you can't sleep for 48 hours or whatever the process was even 5 years ago. Whereas now it's, you shouldn't be socially isolated. You can look to your peers for support. You can look to your friends for support. You can get back out and do some level of exercise, provided you're managing the symptom and you're not exacerbating your symptom presentation in that. And so it's a bit of a shift that's come about, even from when that paper was originally, the research was done and published. Yeah.
No, I mean, you brought up some amazing points there, and I find that just completely fascinating in how you grouped, the subjects or the athletes in your case in proactive, reactive, and different. And I think that translates to a lot of different parts of the support circle, where you're probably going to have, certain friends that will be proactive, reactive, or indifferent, teams and coaches and so forth. And so I guess with that notion, I'm curious, as we have the Sport North Federation here in attendance, how can sport organizations be more on the proactive side of things when it comes to measuring these injuries in their athletes?
Yeah, well, it gets to, at one point, you have to understand that every athlete's going to sort of conceptualize this differently. There are just differences among people where one approach might not be the best for everyone. But if you're looking to maximize engagement in positive behavior, these protective behaviors, it could start with something as simple as this notion of social support, is ensuring that it not even so much that the athlete goes through the process, but everybody around them is encouraging them to go through that process, right? And we see that, like I said before, when individuals have that peer support, the recovery, it's a much more positive recovery process. And so we named it that sort of proactive, reactive, is the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. But it's good for sort of framing what that looks like. And if sport organizations are looking to take that approach to measuring and then educating about concussions, the proactive approach says not to wait for policy and laws like Rowan's Law to be established to say you have to, and do it. Because when we look at something like Rowan's Law, again, it says you have to have this education piece, you have to have this return to play process, and those are good foundations. But we know that that's the case. Before it was in the US, it was the Lysted Law, similar situation. Now here in Ontario, it's the Rowan's Law. We shouldn't have to wait for a policy to tell us we have to. We should start thinking about these things and how this can be integrated. And so in a practical sense, like I said, with the education, something as simple as building that encouraging, and that can go for all injuries too. That doesn't even necessarily have to just be concussions, but that peer support is such a critical piece in that.
And Mike, we've talked with you before, and we really love your perspective. And the one thing that really stuck with me, even the last time we talked, was you talking about the promoting the values of like a lifelong athlete, and just like talking about that and kind of sharing how like organizations can shift that focus, especially when it comes to an athlete's health, to ensuring that athletes are able to participate in sport later in life and not go through that indifferent period where they're kind of numb to what a concussion is. So I guess my question here is, can you tell us a bit more about like how an organization can implement these values into like what they're doing, and to create that lifelong athlete approach opposed to kind of those negative deterrents around the health?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think by being proactive on issues such as concussion recovery, education, so forth, even that, it goes forward and says to the organization and the members within that sporting community that you care about this and that this is important. And so when you implement stuff, thinking, say, from a parent's perspective, they'll see, oh, well, this organization cares about the safety of my child. They're making changes that are positive changes. They're looking to develop, they're looking to make this safer. And it depends on, obviously, on the focus of the organization, whether it's the sort of high performance or an amateur sport league or what that looks like, because there's all sorts of different things. But at the end of the day, there's this value that you can promote with that lifelong athlete versus the performance in the now. So even just reframing that for some of those athletes who are very performance driven around, well, you can't perform if you don't play, and you can't play if you're injured. So how can we look to the long term so you can play the sport as long as you possibly can? And that can start with things like inviting other stakeholders or community members in to have that say, to have that voice, and tell them things like why they love playing and the value, the ethos of the sport that brought them to that in the first place, and really engaging with that and using that in your conversations. But I think, looking at it from this sort of proactive piece, I think if we're looking at from a top-down perspective, that sets the tone, that says we care about player safety because we're implementing these in our sport, and this is important to us and to those within the community. And then that, even just that, has such a profound impact.
And it really does. And I know, I mean, I love talking with you, Mike, because you have such a holistic understanding to this injury and how it ripples into so many different aspects of the athlete's life. And you've gone one step further. Now you're a member of Rugby Canada's Canada Blue Card Working Group. And we can learn a lot about this blue card rule that has been implemented in rugby. And so I was wondering if you can kind of touch upon, talking about, the idea of having these factors in the game and showing that we prioritize the health, how other sport organizations and governing bodies can learn from this proactive approach.
Well, I think in some instances, like just talking from sort of the broader perspectives on sports, it says to other sports too, like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Here's strategies that are implemented. And if you're talking about efficient use of resources, and you can pull from other organizations that have tried different approaches and tailor them to your own sport. And so I guess I'll start by highlighting, what the blue card is. So in rugby, when an athlete engages in some sort of dangerous behavior, they'll get a yellow card, a little timeout, saying that what they did was bad. If it's really bad, they'll get a red card, and then they're not allowed back in the game. But we've introduced this idea of a blue card, and so a blue card is pulled when there's a suspected incident of concussion. A concussion event occurs. The athlete is expressing some sort of symptomology or signs. Maybe they're unsteady on their feet, or they're slurring, or perhaps even they're as far as being unconscious or whatever. Something happened, whether the referee or whoever saw it or not, but the information was shared with the match official. The match official pulls a blue card. The athlete is removed from play. And the important thing here is that it flags the athlete on the system. On Sport Lomo is what they use for their to sign up for rugby and to make your rosters, to make your game sheets are all located on that and so forth. And so what they've done is when a blue card is pulled, a match official completes a report, and that athlete's profile is flagged with a blue card. And so they're not actually allowed to be named back to a roster, play in a subsequent game until they get medical clearance. And so they go and they get a confirmed diagnosis, they go through the return to play, and they upload their confirmed recovery or that they've gone through the process and it's been signed off by a medical professional, at which point the blue card is then removed from their profile and they can return to play. And so this serves a couple purposes. On one, it really takes the responsibility out of the hands of the athlete. The match official sort of absolves them of that guilt associated with taking themselves off, because it's saying, this isn't up to you anymore. We care about your well-being. This is whether you recognize it now or not. And if it is wrong, then the medical professionals will identify that throughout the process, and you can get back to playing sooner. But it also serves as a way to record and track and get some sort of idea of the extent to which concussions are happening in the sport as well. And so it's a sort of dual function there that I think is really, really beneficial.
Yeah, no, I think that dual function and being able to actually track as well it's such an important piece. And like, honestly, having that in rugby nowadays, and rugby's perceived as one of those really aggressive sports, even though I played it and I know that it's also founded on a tremendous amount of respect, where I feel as though having that there and having the match official actually be able to kind of be that neutral third party, as you will, to be able to kind of pull people out of the game, that's so important. And then the measuring piece, allowing the doctor to be involved with it as well, I think that's just tremendous. So I guess a question on that is, so what elements of technology are involved with that? So just what is happening from you pull the blue card, who's actually implementing that into the system? If we are to like think about it for how other sports can adapt it, like how is that being tracked that way?
From a technological perspective, it requires some sort of reporting process or system in place. As I mentioned, Rugby Canada relies on the Sport Lomo system for that, which is good. They've adapted the system to help facilitate that. In terms of what I think you're asking here partially is in terms of burden on those involved in the process. And it puts a heavy emphasis on match officials, but from my experience, they're quite willing to take that up in the name of, on one hand, it really clarifies their roles in a lot of ways around sort of these gray area situations where was it a hit, was it a bad hit, are they exhibiting signs or symptoms where there's something a little finite to pulling a card and making that sort of formalizing that process for them. But like I said, it takes that responsibility away from the athlete and the coach and the parents. And in terms of the burden on the sport administrators, they're the ones who manage the system, who go through and approve or send the follow-up emails and so forth. Eventually, I'm sure it'll be automated, but as it stands now, that's how it's working. Though I do know that they'll be looking to implement this. Again, right now, this is only in Ontario, but they'll be looking to implement this in other provinces, provincial rugby unions who maybe don't have the same technological resources yet, But that I think that's the intention with it, as I understand it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how that kind of develops, and even if there aren't the technological resources that you would need to actually have that system be as efficient, I still think that it could work in its own right. For as of right now, just looking at it as a base model at the very least. But yeah, I really appreciate you sharing all of that. And I guess for you, Mike, would you be able to just kind of share like your main tidbit that you'd like to impart on we got in here, we got coaches, parents, and sport administrators. Just like from your perspective, how can they best be helping out with concussions? I know we've talked a lot about the proactive approach, but yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
My, I guess my takeaway would be, don't be hesitant to change. We don't like necessarily when things change with our sports, or it adds a little burden here or there. This is such a new space, and organizations need to have that room to try things out and to sort of tweak what that looks like for it to be successful. There's very few instances that I can think of ever where a change has been made and it's just been, okay, well, that's it, that solved the problem, right? It's not that simple, and concussions definitely aren't that simple. And so being supportive when that might mean a little extra work on your part, or a little confusion or inconsistency between games on from a coaching perspective. Is this athlete allowed back in? Are they not? What is, that's one thing with the blue card. For instance, it's implemented in the Marshall League, so the amateur adult rugby league, but it's not in the OUA yet, with the Ontario University Athletics. So in certain situations, referees are using it, but in others they're not. And so that's part of those growing pains. And I guess my takeaway would be to urge or encourage everybody on the call to embrace that and recognize that it takes a bit of trial and error to get it right.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate you being here. And if you can stay on for the Q&A at the end, we'd be really appreciative of that. But some just incredible, valuable insights that you shared, and just how we can really evolve. And I think that sentiment of, not trying to just like stay in the lane and trying to, expand our horizons when it comes to this, I think is so pivotal. So really appreciate, everything that you've been doing for, pushing forward concussion education and awareness and understanding on so many different levels. So thanks for being here, Mike.
Yeah, happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
Awesome. So we're now going to bring in Kylie and get an athlete perspective. We talked about the coach and the role that they have. We've looked at, the research and how, overall just sport governing bodies, the way that they can really have an impact within this recovery journey, within this injury. And now we want to bring in Kylie and really talk about, how this injury can really affect an athlete, their identity, how different, her experience was to, what Ryan and I experienced. And I also want to take this time to let everyone that's, with us know that if you want to start putting in some questions in the Q&A, feel free to do that. We will get to that at the end here, and really look forward to kind of having an even further open dialogue on this topic. So we got Kylie here. Kylie, thank you so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it. And if you can kind of just start by sharing your personal experience with this injury, we'd really love to hear from you.
Yeah. So, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So obviously this is something that is so close to my heart. So currently I am studying my master's, at Brock, in disability studies. I've graduated from Western University with a double major in disability studies and art. So my first concussion actually wasn't, diagnosed, which I think is a common trend with a lot of athletes. They sustain concussions and they actually don't really realize that they have. And I didn't realize that I had until many years later. Basically, I play soccer. I'm a defender. I passed the ball back to my goalie. She looked a little strange. She cleared the ball. I ducked to get out of the way and I took it right off the side of my head. Um, Immediately, it was dizziness, confusion. I didn't know where I was. The pitch was tilted. I had no clue, but I shot my coach a thumbs up, and I kept playing. It wasn't until 2013 that I sustained my major concussion. They are all, of course, yes, like you guys said, mild traumatic brain injuries. I really just qualified it as major as shortly after sustaining my concussion. It actually happened during a practice. It was early preseason, so the ball, it's hard, it's wet, it's gross, the ball's heavier. And one of my teammates had played in a corner kick, and I was judging it, thought I had it, stumbled a bit, and that fraction of a second was enough to throw everything off. And I took the ball straight off the top of my head. And immediately I knew something was wrong. It radiated through my entire body. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was just like kind of weird. Went home, thought nothing of it. And I was actually my first symptom was my eyes. So they would get locked in position and I would zone out. So I was watching a Leafs game and I'm trying to follow and I can't. My eyes get stuck and then I have no idea what's going on. I can't follow anything. So I went to bed. I was like, I'm just tired. It's fine. Go to bed. My mom drops me off at school the next morning and she says, maybe you have a concussion. And I was like, no, I don't. So sure enough, as the day progresses, I'm in my 12th year of high school. As the day progresses, the lights are horrible. It's like staring into the sun. I can't focus on anything. I don't really know where I am. I'm kind of just stumbling through the halls trying to get to wherever I'm supposed to be. And the first person that I told was my soccer coach who came to get me from class. And I said, I think I have a concussion. And that's all I remember. The next thing that I remember is being in the hospital to be diagnosed by a doctor who, like Mike said, the protocols back then in 2013 were very different from they are now. So I was in a dark room. I was by myself for months on end, going through the recovery process, which was all in all 2 years. It was a year before I was cleared to go back to play. And kind of as Ryan said, the symptom onset for everybody is going to be a little bit differently. So, like I said, my first was my eyes. And within 24 hours, once I had gotten to the hospital, I had lost the ability to speak. I couldn't walk. My back and neck completely seized up, and my eyes stopped working. So they were closed and stuck in one position. So that all happened. Um, it seems gradually, but when all of a sudden you're in it, it's the blink of an eye. And so that is a little bit about about my initial concussion and where it all started, I guess.
Thank you so much for sharing. Wow, yeah, that must have been a surreal experience for you to be going through that and just to, yeah, like you said, it's a blink of an eye, even though it was gradual, but those are profound changes from a head injury that you sustained in sport, right? Like, I guess what was it like going through that and realizing like my life is changing right before my eyes? I was just playing sports with my friends and now all of a sudden I'm here. What is that process like for you? And I guess the second part to that is how did you work from there to get back to where you are now?
Yeah. So it was terrifying. There's no really way of sugarcoating it or beating around the bush. It was terrifying. And I remember being in the emergency room with the doctor that diagnosed me. And he was like, I couldn't speak at that point. And he was like, she'll be fine. Give her 2 weeks in a dark room. She's going to be okay. And the only thing going through my head is, does he know that I can't talk? Does he know that I can't move anything? Does he know? And I can't say anything. So I'm sitting there with a lot of myself in a stranger's hands, and all the thoughts going through my head are just the worst case scenario, basically. And so it was a lot of fear. It was a lot of the unknown. which is what ended me in a major depressive episode. It was every time I went to have an update or go to my physiotherapist, it was am I going to get better? And their reaction was always, due to the nature of the injury, we can't say for sure what your prognosis is going to be, which is, like Seth was saying, you have your 80% that recover completely within 2 to 4 weeks. And then there's the 20% outliers that end up with prolonged complex recoveries. And I quickly found myself in that 20%. I had I was blessed with a wonderful, wonderful rehabilitationist who actually specialized in female sport concussions. He was a chiropractor. He knew what to do and when to do it. So that was, if it weren't for him, I don't know what would have happened, where I would be today. And so it was the support of him and my family and my friends. I didn't see my teammates for a big portion of it because I was away from the field. I was away from my teammates for a year before I was cleared for any sort of return to play schedule or anything like that. So it was a lot of support from people and just kind of putting my head down, doing the work that I had to do as carefully and patiently as possible, which when you are an athlete and you just want to get back out there, patience is like the last thing on your mind. All you want to do is just, everything's fine. I'll just hop back in there. What, how bad can it be? Right. And it was patience. That's all I could really stress. Was it got better, and it was so long, but it slowly progressed.
Yeah, that would be such a long process. I can only imagine. Like, honestly, I guess something that we've heard and we've talked about before, with other people, but just the urge to want to go back before you're ready, right? Like, you're a competitive athlete, and naturally you want to be with your teams, you want to be in that social environment. Like, did that ever cross your mind? How did you work through those issues? Like, what was going on there?
Absolutely. It was the one thing that I wanted to do, was just get back out there. I actually, I was in high school at the time, and it was soccer season, and we were competing for WASA. And I'd been told, you can't do anything, don't do anything. You're in your room, you're not going anywhere. At that point, I was already kind of spiraling into my depression. I didn't really know what was up, what was down, basically. And I argued with my mom. I said, I want to go and watch my team play. And she stared at me as the way that many mothers do. And she said, I don't know if that's a good idea. And I said, I'll have my blanket. I had a hard time regulating my body temperature afterwards. I was like, I'll have my blanket, wear my sunglasses, I'll have my hat on, everything will be okay. So she let me go and watch the WASA game, which we lost. We lost in a scramble play in the box, something that typically would have been right in my wheelhouse. And as we were sitting after the game, my coach, who was the one I disclosed my injury to, so he was the first person that knew, he looked at everybody and he said, you can all blame Kylie for this. And the shock was unparalleled. I can't speak. I can barely move, and I am the one with the blame on my shoulders. And that was rocking. It put me back. Why am I here? What am I doing? Like, do I want to come back to this? What am I actually working for? And so there, of course, were moments of doubt where it was like, is this something that I want to get back into? But you can't take an athlete out of the game. I mean, I think that's something we all share, is that innate desire to compete. As Seth was saying, we are creatures of competition. And that was something that never changed. I was in my basement in my room doing just tiny drills, just ball handling, stuff like that, before I was cleared to play contact or anything like that. And it was because I wanted to be in something familiar. And that familiarity, I think, is something that a lot of athletes struggle with, is that we have a very structured routine. We wake up, we go to practice, we go to school, we do this, we go to a game, and we have our pre-game rituals and our post-game rituals, and everything becomes very routine. And when you suffer a concussion, there is no routine anymore. Everything is kind of thrown to the wind. Time means nothing. Um, Everything is a what if almost. So it was I always wanted to go back. Every moment of it, that's what I was working for, but it had to be at the proper time.
Yeah, and yeah, sorry, go
I
ahead,
I
Seth.
was just gonna say, like, I mean, it's tough, obviously, because I think what gets lost is the fact that as athletes, like, especially growing up playing sports, it becomes our identity in a way, and we have such a deep rooted affiliation to all kind of sports, but especially when you're specializing in one. And when you brought up, the story of your coach and the shock that you experienced, for those that weren't able to see, both me and Ryan had that same shock because to an extent we can empathize with that feeling of putting the blame or having, whether it's your teammates or your coaches, put this blame on you because you're not out there when they don't even know what you're going through. Because as we mentioned earlier, this is an invisible injury and not everyone can see, unlike a cast or a broken arm where you would have a cast. When it's in your head, and you're snuggled up in a blanket, people are like, oh, you know she's just being all cozy and comfortable. So, I bring this up because my question to you is, that's definitely what, coaches shouldn't say. We've kind of now addressed, what they shouldn't say to an athlete, but what kind of communication do you think you would like to hear, or athletes should be hearing from their coaches and parents and teammates, for those that are listening to this?
Yeah, I think um, the most important role outside of being an advocator as a teammate is as a coach. Um, Coaches really do become your parent outside of home. You see them a lot, you look up to them, you look to them for guidance, you look for them for cues on plays, on what to do, what not to do. And so a coach's role is so important. And I like what Scott is doing. It is very, I want to know your history. I want to know what's going on. I want to know when you feel certain symptoms. And if you do, it's time to take a rest. And it's emphasizing that there's nothing wrong with rest, even as an athlete. And I think that's why, I mean, that's why you do post game and you rest, right? You stretch, you rest, you re-regulate yourself. And it is the same with your head, and that is the coach's biggest role, is creating a culture of acceptance and understanding. My high school coach clearly didn't do that very well. But I had amazing club coaches. The club coach that I was playing for at the time, he didn't want anything. He wanted updates. Other than that, he stayed out of it. He said, whenever you are ready, come back. Your spot is here. It's not going anywhere. You have nothing to worry about. Just focus on yourself. Um, and that was my one club coach. And a couple years later, I got transitioned into a different club, a different coach, and he wanted to know about my history. So he wanted to know, what's up? How was your last concussion? What did your recovery look like? What should I be on the lookout? Symptom wise, if you start to exhibit these things, should I be pulling you out? Um, Knowing your players, because we all know you really well and we catch on to a lot of things that coaches do, and a big part of that is the acceptance and the culture that you create within your team. And whatever you set as the culture for your team is going to trickle down into your players. So coaches have a really big responsibility. And for parents, it's support. It's support, support, support without shame. Um, there's a study done, and it is talks about basically coaches and parents' roles in concussion rehabilitation. And what often happens to athletes is that because we become so engulfed in our role as an athlete, that we typically turn to other athletes to talk about our experiences. Well, as athletes, we all probably have some sort of head injury that we brushed off and thought was, oh, no big deal. So we find acceptance in that. So if I go to my parent who says, "Well, why are you playing in that anyways? You knew you were going to get hurt." That just turns me back into my team. And if the culture isn't good from the team set by the coach, then that can become really dangerous, because you have an athlete who is suffering and is only turning back into the culture that is perpetuating the stigma and the stereotypes of what a concussion is and how serious it is. So I the roles are so important, and the way that you conduct yourself in front of your team is going to set the standard for what they feel comfortable coming to you with.
Yeah, I absolutely could not agree more. That was well said. And I'd like to really thank you for this, Kylie. And yeah, just everything that you shared, your story is so powerful. And it's amazing to see you where you're at now, and how you're using that experience to educate others. It's really special. So thank you for everything.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So basically, we're going to transition to a question period now. I think I saw a question in the chat that's a pretty big one that I'm sure everybody will want to touch on to some extent. So I'm going to bring in all the panelists now.
And I think for those that are with us, we have three very educational, as we've heard from all of them throughout this last little bit, very informative individuals when it comes to just understanding the scope of this injury and the interworkings of how it impacts, athletes, coaches, parents, teammates, uh, governing bodies. So yeah, if there's any questions that you'd like to ask any one of these amazing panelists that Ryan or myself didn't get the chance to, please feel free to put it in. I do believe Rita has put one in here in
Yeah,
the chat.
we got a question from Rita, and thank you, Rita, for posing this question. I really think it's a great one. As a coach or parent, how do you ensure that concussion recovery is a collaborative approach? So, for an example, between coaches, teachers, athletic trainers, school administrators, how do you ensure everyone is working together in the best interest of the athlete, ensuring there isn't any mixed messaging? I'm gonna let everybody think. Yeah, here we go, Scott. I see Scott here.
I can, sure. It's
Absolutely.
communication. Nobody wants to just hear no, right? So if you're looking at a player and a parent saying no, they can't play, they get defensive. So communicating, what are the reasons? What are we looking at? I go through the process with the parent. I do the concussion checks on the field with the parent and tell them what I'm looking for and what I want to see. And then they feel they're a part of it and they understand why. In soccer, where I coach, it's about coordination. So there's a lot of things you can do with a soccer ball and movement to show that the coordination is off and the player is not quite ready. So I think if you bring the parents into it, then they feel a part of the situation. And you're making the decision together rather than just telling them, no, the player's not ready. So that's my opinion. But
Yeah, I just like to echo that too. Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yeah, we can hear you, Mike.
Okay. Like around the communication, this is kind of what I was getting at when, saying like invite voices to be heard there, because when you have administrators who are communicating with coaches, who are communicating with parents, like all of that is like that's what that is in practice. Like that's doing that support or having that athlete focus. In terms of mixed messaging, it gets a little bit difficult in certain circumstances where perhaps the athlete is a multi-sport athlete, and so it's not just the concussion that happened in hockey, but it's the ski coach that needs to know about this stuff in a different organization and whatnot, and there can be some mixed messages across that. But I think at the end of the day, everybody wants, like, the goal of it is to keep that athlete safe and have them recover and return to the sport. But yeah, just echoing what Scott said, I think it starts with communication, and also recognizing that there are others who might need to be involved in that too, just beyond that immediate sport in certain situations.
Yeah, I agree with Scott and Mike. Communication, it's huge, which just seems so repetitive, but it's true. Communication and education. Nobody can be on the same page if we have differing levels of education. If some of us are operating under certain stereotypes and stigma where we don't think a concussion is a major injury, then that person, through no fault of their own, will not be operating in the best interest of that athlete. So the education has to be there across the board. That's why Rowan's Law and the information sessions that teams are required to do under Rowan's Law. That is why that is so important, because it keeps everybody on the same starting page. And from there, you can then develop and strengthen your communication to make sure that the steps that are being done by the rehabilitationist are being echoed in practice, and that the coach is supporting the ensuring that the athlete is following a recovery plan. Everybody has to be operating in the best interest of that athlete, not for the team, not for their own personal interests, and that can easily be missed, and that is it's dangerous, and it's detrimental to an athlete trying to bring yourself back to who you were, because your identity, it's shot basically if you're an athlete and you can't participate. um, you have enough to focus on as the athlete, so you need people in your corner that are going to advocate for you on times that you can't.
Yeah, and in terms of like bringing everybody together and ensuring that we can all work together, yeah, the communication piece is it's pretty much that is the end all be all, and just ensuring like from a top down approach that we're open about these injuries can happen. There is an inherent risk of sport, and just acknowledging it as something that it's not natural, but it is in a way. And we just have to be mindful of the fact that people do experience these things. And as we heard from Kylie, like it can drastically change the way your life is and how it operates. So being mindful of all of that is something that is so important for this. And in terms of the communication piece, Rita, I definitely want to say that ensuring that there's no mixed messaging. I feel like just having one clear cut, like removal is necessary if it's even suspected, right? Like that is always the first step. And then from there, it's almost like a day-to-day approach from then on out, where it's just like evaluating how they're feeling every day, ensuring that they're still trying to progress, but not necessarily pushing themselves too far, and just ensuring that it's a constant communication throughout. And I see Mike has his hand up there. I'd love to hear from you, Mike.
Yeah, just expanding on that, if we're looking at Rowan's Law as establishing what the standard is in terms of education, these processes, going beyond that, if we're looking at communication as this sort of actionable thing that individuals can do to ensure that everyone's on the same page here, that starts from an organizational perspective, is ensuring that there's channels for that communication to occur. And so it's great to say, yeah, well, if there's concerns, like you can talk to us, but are there emails? Is there, a concussion person within these different clubs who kind of takes the lead on that? Like, what does that look like? And so not just, it goes beyond simply saying the communication, but establishing what that communication, how that communication is supposed to occur. And I'll give the example with the blue card. One of the ways in which we've done that with Rugby Canada is something as simple as having an institutional or organizational email that they can, express concerns or chat about the process with an administrator, but also on the reporting process, just any comments or concerns or things that anybody shared regarding that incident or the process of that return with the athlete, that sort of lets everybody who has access to that profile know and is then aware of when considering that recovery.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And yeah, just having that tangible communication structure would be so integral to all of what we're talking about here. Absolutely agree. Scott, I see your hand up. Would love to hear from you too.
Thanks, Ryan. Just one thing I thought of too with the communication aspect and the recovery approach. Back in my playing years, when I was injured and I could be out for periods of a time, I felt like I'd never heard from the team. I didn't hear from the coach. You were there and you would support and you would go watch, but it's almost like if you couldn't play, you weren't a part anymore. So one of my approaches has been to involve that player. So when I have players who are out for any injury, not just a head injury, I still involve them. I've actually taken the time to bring them in. And again, some of the older teenagers, why don't you coach with me? Why don't I show you the side of what I do and give them a part of something? And I think that's really been a strong thing from the mental aspect of the player who is upset from being out as well too. And I think that's part of it as well. And that's helped gain the respect, I think, with parents and players. And they're respecting my judgment of when a player is ready to go back, because I've included them and I've involved them, not just shut them out until they're ready to go. And I think because of that, they're not necessarily rushing to get back in before they're ready. So that's something I guess I would suggest as a best practice from my perspective. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, actually, our colleague Emma, who's working the back end of all this, she actually posed a question directly related to how we can get people involved in this while they're kind of away from their team. So I'm really glad you hit on that, Scott. It's very intuitive and I love it. Love to hear from Kylie. I see your hand up.
Yeah, just following on what Scott said, that involvement, because as an athlete, you already feel alienated. You're going through something that a lot of people don't understand. And it is, as you and Seth have both said, it is the invisible nature of the injury. I can't just show up with crutches and everybody understands. Oh, of course. Yeah, she obviously can't run. And it's deeper than that. And so that alienation and the isolation, especially depending on your practitioner and how up to date they are with concussion protocols, you may be in a room for a couple weeks by yourself, and that damaging in and of itself. So to know that your team is still there and is rooting for you and is in your corner and is like, you know what? I understand you can't play. Maybe come out and, as Scott said, come and run some drills with me, see what we can involve you in. Come out and watch a game, if that's something that you're up for. It's just making it so that the lines of communication stay open and that you, as the athlete, know that if you need anything from your coach, they're going to be there for you. And it's the same as with your teammates. While they don't have that lead role as the coach does, that environment and the coach, taking charge and being like, we're going to have Kylie in, it's going to be great. Don't, roughhouse her around, she's going to be running some drills. Don't give her a hard time. And just having everybody in your corner and the inclusion is huge, especially when you start to think of the mental health aspect of things and how many people with concussions end up with depression and anxiety and the isolation and so many things that compound one on top of another. And just having a familiar place to go. I think for many of us, no matter what our sport was, that feels like home, whether it's the hockey rink or it's the soccer pitch or it's the baseball diamond or whatever it is, it feels familiar and it's home and it's comforting. So being involved in that in any aspect is going to do wonders for mental health and inclusion.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with each and every one of you. I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest points to bring it all together is the human element that comes with this injury, that comes with the individual experiencing it. Yes, sports, there is this, want and desire to win and to constantly be better. But we need to understand the human that comes first, and that they are, and especially if they're a student, student first then athlete in certain cases, and how pivotal that is. And research even shows that having social support plays a positive role in recovery, in community integration, in decreasing anxiety. And so having that openness, having that communication, and even just everything that all three of you have mentioned, not even only with this question but throughout, I think has been such vital lessons for coaches, for governing bodies, for athletes, for all of us to really understand and try and not only destigmatize this injury, but also try and in attempt preventing further prolonged symptoms. So I can't thank you all enough for sharing your insights, for being here, for being a part of this. We really appreciate it. Also want to thank Sport North Federation for putting this together and bringing us together to do this. I know I love these conversations and these webinars because I keep learning more, and connecting with like-minded people such as yourself is always such an honor. So thank you everyone for being here. Ryan, to close it out.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you everyone. Just to reiterate a lot of what Seth said. So would like to thank Kylie, Scott, and Mike for joining us today and providing the value that you did. Really, truly took home a lot of really great points from each and every one of you. And I think you each were, fantastic throughout the whole thing. So thank you. I'd like to thank our colleague Emma on the back end. She'll be sending out our concussion resource links afterwards. So stay tuned for that. And then, just thank you again, Rita, for having us and allowing us to share our passions and educate everybody about concussions in sports. So thank you. And hope to talk with you all soon. But thank you.
You guys can check out our website at HeadsupCAN.ca to learn more about what we do. And we're constantly doing a lot of stuff. We have a video coming out this week that has a few of the members on the panel in it as well, that we're really excited about for Rowan's Law Day. And yeah, just going to keep, moving towards our mission of challenging the stigma and bringing in people like this to help us with that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.